Hello and welcome to Biology for Beginners. I am your host, Morgan. Today we are looking at the question, what is science? Now, science is defined as an approach to understanding the natural world based on verifiable evidence. But what exactly are you looking at when you're looking at evidence? Where does it really come from? This evidence comes to you in the form of data, which is essentially recorded observations. These observations can either be qualitative, which is like a physical description. So looking at the shapes here on the side of the page, saying the dots are red, the triangles are blue. Those would be qualitative sorts of data. Where if you're looking at quantitative data, that's going to be some sort of numerical measurement, something you can try to make a formula out of, something that you can actually work with in a little bit more of an analytical approach. So 3 dots, 4 triangles, you can reasonably work with those numbers. Whereas just saying red and blue, you can't necessarily work with quite as easily. Now, there's some distinctions we need to make about what science is and is not. Now, it is common to think that science is kind of linear, solitary, you're trying to prove your hypothesis, and that science is static, meaning that it is this one thing that stays the same constantly. None of that is true. Science is actually a fairly fluid process, meaning you don't get from point A to point B cleanly. There's a lot of twists and turns you kind of need to take, and a lot of that does mean failed experiments and whatnot. Science is collaborative. You'll almost never see a researcher or a scientist working alone. They're constantly talking to peers, constantly reading studies, and working with other experts in their field or any other fields that their study is adjacent to. And you're not proving a hypothesis, you're supporting a hypothesis if the data that you collect is favorable. Science never really proves anything. It's just supports. At any point, a hypothesis could be disproven if the appropriate data were to be unearthed. And science is constantly progressing. The way people do science is constantly changing. It's not the same as it was even 50 years ago. There's constantly new ways to go about experimenting and asking questions and finding the evidence that will support different ideas. Now, generally, when you're going to be doing science, you're going to be following the scientific method, which at some point in grade school, most kids are going to hear about. As you get into middle school and high school, it becomes a little bit more defined. And essentially what it's going to be is you observe something, you form a question. From that question, you form your hypothesis. From that hypothesis, you're going to make some sort of prediction about what you think you're probably going to see with your experiment or observation. Then you're going to collect your data or experiment, however that comes about. You're going to sit down and analyze that data. You're going to come to a conclusion and then essentially repeat. And it's not really a linear process because sometimes your conclusion is going to be your experiment didn't work and you have to start from the drawing board to test that hypothesis. So what you can see here in the figure is a kind of triangular flow process with the formation and testing of hypotheses in the middle. Now, this particular image is from the book on page 9, but it's not necessarily my favorite way to represent the scientific method. This particular image that makes everything more circular is a more common way I've seen in my own coursework to reflect the scientific method. And it just tends to better encapsulate what science is. So, however you're going to look at it, the scientific method is an ongoing process. You're constantly going to be making observations, coming up with questions, thinking of your hypotheses to answer those questions, and developing a prediction that is testable, refining, altering, what have you, until you collect evidence and either support or refute your initial hypothesis. Now, at this point, it is important to know exactly what a hypothesis is. A lot of people tend to teach it as an educated guess or a question, which are not exactly very good ways of teaching it once you get to a higher level of science and understanding. If you're teaching a child, that's probably the best way to explain it to them. However, what a hypothesis actually is a testable explanation for a set of observations based on the available data. So it is essentially the foundation of any predictions that are going to be made for the subsequent experiments or data collections that are going to happen. Hypotheses are backed up by either the literature in the subject that you are looking at or some sort of observation that has been made. Hypotheses aren't just a random guess. They're not pulled out of thin air. Hypotheses come directly from observations and questions and data that already exists. And this is also why a hypothesis is not a question. A hypothesis is a possible answer to a question that has already been asked. Now, once a hypothesis is formed and predictions are made, any researcher or scientist is going to need to collect data. And this is done in two main ways. Now, I would like to note that these are not the only ways to go out and collect data, but these are the two most basic ways that basically form the foundation of any other data collection method. The first thing that we're going to talk about is controlled experimentation. And a controlled experiment is an experiment where an experimental group is compared to a control group, where these two groups only vary on the factor that's being tested. And from these experiments, what you're going to see are two very important variables. The independent variable, which is the thing that's being manipulated or changed by those researchers, and a dependent variable, which is the outcome of the manipulation or what they're actually measuring. So if you're measuring if a certain fertilizer makes a plant grow better, then your independent variable is going to be the fertilizer that's being added, and your dependent variable is going to be the plant growth. Now, a couple seconds ago, I mentioned experimental groups and control groups. And basically, the difference between those are the experimental group is the group in which the manipulation is happening, so the fertilizer is being added. And the control group has absolutely no manipulation, and this is the group that basically makes your baseline. So there would be no fertilizer being added to that group of plants. And then in the end, they would compare the growth of the control group with no fertilizer to the group of the plants with fertilizer, or the experimental group, to come up with their conclusion. In humans, this type of experimentation can be seen specifically with clinical trials in like medicines, where this whole experimental and control group thing is taken one step farther with a double-blind study, meaning that even the scientists don't know which person is in which group. So the data is even more anonymous. The other main way of collecting data is just going to be using some sort of observational data, which basically means you're going out and either looking at some data that's already been collected in other experiments that would be relevant to the question you're asking and the hypothesis that you made, and there's like no manipulation really involved, or you're gonna go out and just observe what you're seeing. So an example of just using some sort of observational data would be going out to a forest, counting how many blue jays in the area if you're looking at the health of like blue jay populations. You're not manipulating anything, you're just going out with a clipboard and counting. Once the data is collected, then you move on to the analyzing and concluding steps. And essentially what these are is sitting down, crunching the numbers from the data, and deciding if the results support or refute the hypothesis. If it does, the next question that needs to be asked is, can these results be repeated? And either the experiments run again, or even more data is collected if it was an observational study. And if the answer is no, you can form a new hypothesis or create a new experiment if there's some indication that your experiment may have been flawed or another reason why it didn't work. And once enough data is collected and enough support for your conclusion is made, often what's going to be done is some sort of paper is going to be written and submitted to a publication for some sort of peer review so that it's out there in the world and in the body of scientific knowledge. Now, when a paper is submitted for peer review, it's important to know what peer review is and why it's so important in the scientific world. Peer review is a process where impartial experts in the field will review a study that is submitted for publication. It's often anonymous, not always, but the best peer reviews are going to be anonymous. And it is imperative that the reviewers are in no way associated with the study that they're reviewing. A lot of times, this is going to result in the original researchers getting their study back with notes about how it should be improved before it's actually published. And this helps keep the scientific body of knowledge as accurate as possible. And once the study does get published, if it does get published, then these experiments will often be repeated by other teams of scientists to see if they can gather similar data. And this particular part in the process helps to determine if any conclusions made, any data collected were just flukes, and if something in the initial experiment was flawed, or alternatively, if any of the numbers might have been messed with, if they can't repeat the results in any significant way. However, the best studies are repeatable. So by being published after peer review and then being repeated by other teams of scientists, it helps to support those hypotheses. Now, once a hypothesis has enough evidence and support behind it, it may possibly be worked into such a broad sense that it may be elevated to the level of theory. It is important to note that a scientific theory is not the same as what an everyday use of the word theory is. A scientific theory is not just an idea. A scientific theory is a widely accepted explanation, essentially, that is much broader than a specific hypothesis, and it generates new hypotheses under its umbrella. And it's also supported by a very large body of evidence that has usually gone through quite a lot of peer review over the decades and years, what have you, that it has been around. Two fairly good examples of theories are the theory of relativity and the theory of evolution by natural selection. Both have very, very wide bodies of evidence to support them, and they're also fairly broad when you look at their definitions. There are constantly new hypotheses that are being generated within those umbrellas. However, the theory itself is a broad explanation of the natural phenomena that is being observed. The last thing that we're going to touch upon today in this lesson is the technology connection. And this is the biggest way in which science touches everyday life. Now, technology can be defined as the application of science for a specific purpose. And it's kind of like a circular thing almost, like most of science. The progression of science allows for the progression of technology. When you get new technologies, then science can progress again. And as both of these progress, so can everyday life. Now, you can see this in your phone, which I'm sure is probably in your pocket, or possibly it's what you're watching this on. It can also be seen in things like microscopes and new medicines, and basically anything you come in contact with was at one point in time, no matter how primitive it seems, a revolutionary technology. So again, as science progresses, technology progresses. As technology progresses, science progresses. As science and technology both progress, everyday life and society will progress. All right, I hope to see you guys all next week in our next Bio for Beginners series. I hope you found some value in this lesson. And if you want the PDF of my PowerPoint, remember to hop on over to my Patreon, where it is available for free. We'll see you guys all next time.
Thank you for watching this video. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you have not already done so. Also remember to follow me on all my social medias. The links are down in the description below, and check out thereptilegoth.com. If you found any value in this and you would like to support the channel, assuming you have the means to do so, go ahead and check out the Patreon. Again, that link is going to be down in the description below, just like everything else. See you next time.